My guest at this time is Alireza Jafarzadeh. He is the Deputy Director of the Washington office of the National Council of Resistance of Iran. The organization was also the author, just a couple of years ago, of the book Iran, The Rise of the Revolutionary Guard's Financial Empire, How the Supreme Leader and the IRGC Robbed the People to Fund International Terror. Well, now there's been some big news from the U.S. State Department when it comes to the IRGC. We want to get Alireza's reaction to the Trump administration naming the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps as a foreign terrorist organization. And Alireza, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you very much, Greg. Appreciate it.
Well, let's start with the explanation, or at least a piece of the explanation, from Secretary of State Mike Pompeo for this designation. Here's what he said.
For 40 years, the Islamic Republic's Revolutionary Guard Corps has actively engaged in terrorism and created, supported, and directed other terrorist groups. The IRGC masquerades as a legitimate military organization, but none of us should be fooled. It regularly violates the laws of armed conflict. It plans, organizes, and executes terror campaigns all around the world. From the moment it was founded, the IRGC's mandate was to defend and export the regime's revolution by whatever means possible. The IRGC institutionalized terrorism shortly after its inception, directing horrific attacks against the Marine barracks in Beirut in 1983 and the U.S. Embassy Annex in 1984, alongside the terror group it midwifed, Lebanese Hezbollah. Its operatives have worked to destabilize the Middle East from Iraq to Lebanon to Syria and to Yemen. With this designation, the Trump administration is simply recognizing a basic reality.
So, Alireza, for those who have followed our interviews over the years, I think I would run out of fingers and possibly even toes if I counted the number of times you urged the United States to make this declaration of the IRGC as a foreign terrorist organization. So what is the significance now that this has happened?
Well, you're absolutely correct, Greg, that, we have been calling for this for years. And it's a good day today that this designation is taking place, getting into effect. Because what it does, it just removes this history and the background with the Iran regime that you can wage terrorism all over the world and get away with it. There was going to be, no punishments for what they have done. To the contrary, the Iran regime has benefited from its terrorism, its hostage-taking. They have used the terrorism as a tool to leverage, to gain concessions from Western countries over the past 4 decades. Today, with this FTO designation, the whole situation changes. It puts the Iran regime in a defensive position. It demoralizes the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards, and their proxies and the groups that they're supporting and sponsoring in the region. It actually helps dry up the resources for the militia groups that are funded by the Revolutionary Guards. On the other side, it basically boosts the morale of the people of Iran because they consider the Revolutionary Guards as a major force in suppressing the population, as well as a source that is actually plundering their wealth. It also gives an additional tool to the U.S. government to basically prosecute U.S. persons who are providing material support to the Iranian regime, and not to mention that the European companies who've been dealing with the various institutions in trade and financial transactions over the years, they will think twice before making any trade or investment because their counterparts are likely to be IRGC or affiliate entities. And so because the IRGC controls a big chunk of the Iranian economy, that is going to impact the European trade with Iran. So as a whole, this is a significant move on the part of the State Department to designate the IRGC as an FTO, and overall the stigma that comes with it for the IRGC, which is they really deserve it, is an added benefit to it.
Do you see it leading to less terrorism because they won't have the resources to fund them? Or will it be negligible, at least at first, in the difference?
Well, certainly looking at the past 40 years, the Iran regime, and particularly the IRGC, has been the main source of violence, terrorism, export of what they call the Iranian Revolution, which is nothing but terrorism. And they've been involved in Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Lebanon, Bahrain, to name a few. And they relied on their resources to be able to do that. And once the resources are limited, once they're on their back foot, once they get on a defensive positions, once they get weaker, you will see less capability for the Iranian regime to do the kind of things they've been able to do. So it should definitely lead to less violence and less tension in the region. This is a right step in the right direction for peace and tranquility in the region.
You mentioned that the people of Iran, not the government, but the people will be encouraged by this, I assume because they'll see, if they ever hear about this, because their media is pretty tight-lipped about these things, that the world is paying attention to what's going on in Iran. So you have joined us a number of times in the past couple of years to talk about the popular unrest in Iran. How do you think this will impact that?
Well, the unrest in Iran that, we've talked about a lot was preceded by a number of major protest acts and sit-ins and picket lines and all kinds of things by various sectors of society whose wealth was stolen by the IRGC. In fact, the corruption by the IRGC had a big role in leading to the uprising, nationwide uprising that engulfed as many as 160 cities around the country. So, and this is a serious thing. Just think about it, that one of the entities of the IRGC is called IRGC Cooperative Foundation, is actually regarded as the most powerful financial institution in the whole country. Ansar Bank, which is the fourth largest bank of Iran, is actually owned by the IRGC, which is also a major shareholder in Sadarat Bank. These two banks alone, they have over 3,000 branches in Iran. Another major bank, Pasargad, is also tied to the IRGC. So, and these are the banks that are stealing the people's money, that are contributing to the expansion of the IRGC, but also moving the society towards more poverty. And millions of people live below the poverty line and they're hungry. And at the same time, when you look at the auto industry, which is very profitable for the regime, the second largest automaker in Iran, called Saipa, is actually, controlled by the IRGC. Another entity is called Khatam al-Anbiya, which is actually owned and operated by the IRGC. It's the largest contractor for government projects. It has some 5,000 subcontractors and about 135,000 employees. It has extensive operation in the oil and gas petrochemicals field. And so just last year, they had about $25 billion worth of contract with the government. Where does all that money go? It's all stolen from other contractors, from independent businesses, and given to the IRGC. So that's why when people see that the IRGC, which they see as their enemy, is being blacklisted by the United States, it just gives them more encouragement, more power. They feel they're not alone. They feel their efforts is now finally paying off.
We're talking with Alireza Jafarzadeh, Deputy Director of the Washington Office of the National Council of Resistance of Iran. And as can be expected, the Iranians are not reacting well to this. The Washington Times reports, quote, Iranian officials say they'll respond in kind and will treat U.S. military forces, quote, like the Islamic State all around the world, unquote, suggesting possible violent confrontations between the two sides. Quote, we will answer any action taken against this force with a reciprocal action, 255 Iranian lawmakers said in a letter over the weekend, according to Reuters. quote, so the leaders of America, who themselves are the creators and supporters of terrorists in the Middle East region, will regret this inappropriate and idiotic action. So what do you make of their fierce response here?
Well, the Tehran's reaction very much reminds me of a man whistling past the graveyard. These are all hollow show of force and empty rhetoric by the IRGC and the military commanders, as well as, their so-called parliamentarians and, the foreign minister and all of that. Honestly, the mullahs only understand the language of force, and they back down when confronted with firmness. So, just look at what the regime did in reaction to devastating attacks on the units and proxy forces of the IRGC in Syria in the past few months. They keep doing the rhetoric, but they can't really do anything on the ground. If you recall, over a year ago, the regime had threatened to tear up the nuclear deal, to burn the nuclear deal if the U.S. pulled out of the JCPOA, and to, rapidly resume enrichment. Well, almost a year after the U.S. pulled out of the JCPOA, the mullahs are still searching for a cigarette lighter to burn the agreement. So really, honestly speaking, the regime is much weaker now than it was a year ago in light of all the continued protests and strikes all over the country. The rial, the Iranian currency, has lost 70% of its value, and, some 40% inflation rate, 50% unemployment rate. This is not a regime that can threaten the outside world. They are in a much weaker position. And things have changed, Greg. I recall 22 years ago, around this time, the State Department, after Khatami became president, the so-called moderate president, as a sign of goodwill gesture, they designated our movement as an FTO, as a foreign terrorist organization. It took 15 years for us to fight and overturn the designation that took place in 2012. After extensive, major rulings by the U.S. courts and pressure by the Congress. And now, 7 years later, in 2019, the IRGC, which always boasted about getting us in trouble, is now on the foreign terrorist organizations list. So these are very different times for the people of Iran, for the Iranian regime itself, and for the outside world. There's a great, great chance to see change once and for all after 40 years of the rule of the clerics in Iran. And that day will not be too far.
Alireza, I remember you advocating to be taken off the foreign terrorist list, advocating that the IRGC be put on it. Those have both happened now. What else do you want, if anything, from the U.S. government on Iran policy?
Well, I think they need to follow up this step with further additional similar steps in this regard. For instance, another very important tool for terrorism of the Iran regime is the Minister of Intelligence and Security, also known as the MOIS. This is the entity that uses the Iran regime's embassies around the world to both spy on but plot terror operations. As we speak, 5 Iranian regime so-called diplomats who were all agents of the Ministry of Intelligence have been expelled by European nations just in the past 1 year. And one of their top diplomats, so-called diplomats, an agent of the Ministry of Intelligence, is in jail right now in Belgium because he turned over a powerful explosive to 2 other culprits to detonate it at the major rally by the Iranian resistance, where Mrs. Mariam Rajavi, the leader of the president-elect of the resistance, was speaking before 100,000 people. And, there was a terror plot also right here by Ministry of Intelligence agents. So that entity needs to be also designated as a foreign terrorist organization, so it would dry up the resources of the regime. But also at the same time, what they can do, the administration can, reach out to the Iranian population, because at the end of the day, the only way you can see the change of behavior of the Iran regime is to see the regime itself change by the people of Iran. So the U.S. can help this process by further standing on the side of the Iranian people. There's no need to appropriate money or send troops or boots on the ground. The people of Iran are capable of doing it. They need to align themselves a lot more with the people of Iran and the voices for change while they're building more and more pressure on the regime itself.
We'll be watching. Alireza, thank you very much for your time today, as always.
Thank you so much, Greg. Always a pleasure to be on your show.
Alireza Jafarzadeh, Deputy Director of the Washington Office of the National Council of Resistance of Iran. The group authored the book just a couple years ago, Iran, The Rise of the Revolutionary Guard's Financial Empire, How the Supreme Leader and the IRGC Robbed the People to Fund International Terror. I'm Greg Columbus, reporting for Radio America.